So if we go to the syllabus, we'll see that we have your team projects, and over here we have the individual weekly readings. I inserted the link that directs it to the main document that I'll show you in a second. And every week, it's up to you. You can decide which one of those categories you want to do. You can either do a book chapter from some very interesting books about effective altruism, the life you can save, doing good better, and the most good you can do. But all sorts of things like effectiveness of charities, how to do altruism, what is happiness, all kinds of difficult decisions in life about your own life and about life in general. So you can do book chapters, you can do podcast episodes from some very interesting podcasts, mostly two, 80,000 hours podcast and clear thinking. Some of these episodes can go up to 2 hours. I don't want you to listen for something for 2 hours. All of these tasks, if they take more than 20 minutes, you can decide when you want to log out of that. I just want you to get some basic ideas, to listen to a discussion, to get a feel of a chapter so that you can reflect on it. Of course, if you want to listen to more, if you want to stay longer and go through the whole thing, that's terrific, but try to browse these to kind of get the gist of what it is that they're saying. You can also do a TED Talk or a video. These are typically like 15, 20 minutes, depending on which ones. If it goes for longer, you can definitely cut this. And effective games and tasks, which means that you will need to engage. It will ask you some things about your life, make decisions, do all sorts of things, and then you will get some feedback or something will happen that would hopefully allow you for some learning journey. What does it look like? So it's this document over here. Like most of the things in this course, we do everything collaboratively. So I don't want you to work independently on your own documents and then submit this on the Moodle and then don't see each other. I want you to see what others are doing. Some people will have the same, will choose the same reading. That's completely okay. You can choose something that others have chosen. But I want you to be able to see what others have reflected on, learn from that, build on that, comment on that, say something different, say something similar. I want you to be able to interact with one another and learn from each other. This is what it's going to look like. So some basic guidelines. So generally, I want you to spend something like 15 to 25 minutes reading, listening, playing, doing a task, and then about 5 to 15 minutes of writing. And then some tips that I wrote, like for example, I have a strong preference for audiobooks rather than reading. Then on the MTR, I can listen to the audiobook. So I give you some tips on how to do this, where you can find these things. I also listen to this faster. Like for example, if it's a YouTube TED Talk, I usually listen to this not in the regular speed, but a little bit faster. Maybe at the beginning it's a bit hard, but after a while, kind of helps first train a little bit your English and understanding, but also gets you through things a bit faster. Sometimes when I listen to my talks, it's painful just how slow I go. So I need to speed myself up. So just like some tips that I share with you. Every week you can select. Once you've selected a reading, up to you, which one, just please put your name and the date that you've selected next to that reading so that we know which student did what reading. So we'll have kind of like a track of this. So book chapters, podcast episode, and so forth. And then for each one of those, these are the things that I want you to reflect. So you go on the relevant reading, podcast, whatever that is, and then here you just give your name and student ID. And then for each one of those, just say something. Could be a sentence, a paragraph, however long you want this to be. Just try to make this meaningful. Okay, so what is there? One main thing that you've learned that you didn't know before and why it matters. No need for essays. I don't want you to do 1,000 words. Just like very briefly, what it is that you got from this. One practical takeaway, either for you personally or something more broadly for people in their life. One big positive, one big caveat, or something that you would like to improve, but try to be very constructive about this. And then try to reflect on the effectiveness. So we care a lot about effectiveness in this course, effective altruism. How do we evaluate all sorts of things? We also want to be evaluating our own effectiveness. Is this helpful? Is this reading good? Would you recommend this to other people? How would you know that this is effective or not? And then finally, not a must, if you want, what questions do you have? I will read this and I will try to answer some of these questions in the classroom. What does the, if you've listened to this and there was something inspiring about this, what is it that has inspired you in there? You can choose a combination of these. Try to answer as much as you can, but I don't want you to spend too long on this. The main purpose is to get you to think. The main purpose is not to get you to spend hours to sit down and write this. So really, very, very briefly, and as we go along, like next week, I will give you a little bit of feedback on what it is that you will write for the next class. So we'll do one, I'll give you some feedback, and then hopefully we'll improve. Yeah, so we have this for every reading. Is this clear? Any questions, concerns, things that you want to talk about? Yeah, makes sense? Just curious, do you have any experience listening to podcasts? Like how many of you listen to podcasts? 1, 2, oh, wow, okay, more than I expected. Good. So this will not be completely, out of nowhere for you. Good, all right. Yeah, today complete the, and there's the course syllabus quiz. If you're taking 2 classes, you don't need to do it twice, you just do it once and then tell me that you're in the both classes. Ask you to create a username for ResearchGate, Open Science Framework, and the ORC ID. This is just for us to be able to inform you. If we end up using some of your outputs, first of all, we communicate this to the academic community, but if we end up using this in a co-authored publication, a submission to a journal, you will get credit. And I want you to know that something is happening with what it is that you contributed. Therefore, even if you sign up with your institutional email, all of these platforms have the ability to add your personal email. So make sure that you have a personal email that we can contact you after you graduate, so that we can inform you that you are a co-author on something that came up from this course. Yeah, one last thing. I don't know if you remember, but the overall course score was up to 90 last week, and now it's up to 100. So the weekly readings are increased from 15 to 25%, thereby completing the 100%. So the last 10 I'm going to give to the individual readings because I want you to try and get something from that. I want you to reflect on this, and I want you to come to the class and give something to your classmates, give something to the discussion. So I feel like this deserves more than just 15 points. So trying to balance a little bit the individual aspect and the teamwork aspect. All right, good. So we'll start with some very broad questions about the world. We've done quite a bit in 3 weeks. We've contemplated a lot about morality, right? Trolley dilemmas. We've even seen trolley dilemmas in real life. We've reflected about altruism, heroism. And I think now it's time to reflect a little bit, take a step further and reflect about our nature and try to connect this to some of the classic findings in social psychology. So what do we know in social psychology? What do we know about others around us? So we'll start with a reflection on human nature. I know it's a very broad question, but go with me on this. So you believe that human nature is inherently what? Good, bad, not sure. This is a very strong, deep philosophical debate. as you answer this, try to reflect both on what it is that you feel and what do you think other people here in this classroom or generally around you feel about human nature. So before I show you what others in the classroom have answered, what is human nature? When I say human nature, what comes to mind? Selfish? Okay.
Survival instinct type of thought process like that. This makes sense.
Yeah, like where do you see selfish behavior?
I wouldn't say that you would always see selfish behavior, so that human nature is inherently very selfish and bad, but it's that when there was like a moment of scarcity or you would have to choose one or the other. I think most people who've lived enough of life would choose the selfish path based on the fact that other humans tend to also be quite selfish. So it's like that prisoner experiment that we're all just kind of out at the end.
Wait, which prisoner experiment?
There's two prisoners held in separate cells, and like if you rat out your friends, you get zero.
Yeah.
So we all
Prisoner's dilemma. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. So based on your understanding, giving especially extreme circumstances where you have a choice, you need to make a choice whether you or others, people will go for the more selfish option. So in the prisoner's dilemma, reject, defect or cooperate, this kind of thing. People tend to defect from cooperating with others, something like that. Yeah. How does that sound? Agree? This
very specific position. Like in the prison dilemma, we separate the person in different rooms and we try to force them to defect from each other. But in the reality, we see more cooperation rather than like conflict.
Good. So she gave the example of a prisoner's dilemma. What other contexts you see more cooperation?
For example, in group projects, say in other
projects, yeah.
We certainly see free riding each other, but rather we see some of them contribute more, maybe altruistically, and or people do care about other things. For example, like reputations, that's different. And the findings from what is predicted from the personal dilemma, which is the bad ending to cooperative ending.
Okay, interesting. Okay, yes, please. Let's talk about babies. Yeah, what happens with babies?
Like imagine like a group of babies without the societal influence, and it's like an island or something. So that I'm given like proper, I don't know, like teaching where they're taught to be good. I feel like they will remain good because she mentioned like people are selfish because like they know that others will be selfish.
Right.
It's like a experience. So I feel like they might be selfish because of how the nature.
Yeah. So the nature nurture kind of debate. So you're saying that your perspective of what babies are like, they're like a blank slate, and it depends on society on how we bring them up. If we do a good job of getting them to be inherently good, then they grow up to be good, or they can be bad. So your disagreements with her is that right now your understanding is that we're raising our babies to be more good than bad. Yeah, is that your, yeah, okay. Yes, please.
I think it's quite interesting because I also thought of babies, right?
Yeah.
And one of the first thoughts that popped up was like, it's like a lot of things are learned, right? So how do you actually define nature and nature, right? So he has a point where he was saying group projects and collaboration, we were talking about selfishness, right? And I thought about let's say they're on an island, right? The instinct to survive, right? So then if you're like a group of babies on an island, like young children,
yeah,
like logically speaking, cooperating with people help you maximize your chances of survival. So then with that in mind, then sort of you can argue that it's inherently good. It's purely based on their age though. So then it's very interesting as to like, but also I think it's good because I think everyone is like living something like together.
Do you know some case studies or famous stories about babies being stuck on an island and what happened to them? Not babies, like kids. No, the fly. Flies, yeah. Yeah. So a very famous book, yeah, of what happens when kids are stranded on an island, and what's the end result over there? It becomes chaos, at least in that book, which is really interesting because we're gonna actually talk about that. So let's just see what it is that you said, and then we can move up to something else. Not sure is a good answer, and then to like split on this. Based on your understanding of social psychology, of what you've read, what you've seen, of the research in social psychology, what do you think the research says about human nature? What kind of experiments do you remember about human nature?
But there is like a case, other place where a young girl is murdered and no one helped her.
Yeah, Kitty Genovese, the bystander effect. Yeah. We saw something a little bit like that in the first session in the Chinese context, Wang Yue, right? It's not so much that she was going through something, she got hit, the baby, but the famous one from New York we're actually going to talk about. So thank you. Bystander effect. Anything else? Bystander effect, the end result was that we are what? We don't help, right? Something like that. So inherently bad, perhaps. So your understanding overall, let's see what it is that you reflect on. Mostly bad or not sure. Okay, so here we have a little bit of a tilt from 2-2 to 1-3. So one kind of like shifted, but most of you are still not sure about this. I've started to give this course in 2018, and I gave this for 2-3 years to try and discuss some 2-3 years to try and change people's perspectives on what is it that social psychology is actually saying about human nature. To my great surprise, 2 years ago, these books came out. So actually, Utopia for Realists has been there, I think, 2015. But Humankind came out, Rutger here. And I was so shocked by this that I wrote this Twitter that I want to share with you. I listened to this while I was doing the Dragon's Back, and it was a very pleasant hike overall, but it was made even more pleasant because of this book. So I just like finished the whole book within one hike. So here's what I wrote. To my great surprise, all that I've taught in that class covered great in detail in this remarkable storytelling in Humankind. So we social psychologists really need to discuss what is happening in humankind. Finished listening to this yesterday, putting aside the inspirational message. I think the social psychologists should read the chapters regarding this. The background, I've been teaching this for a long time. I've had this lecture, Human Nature. And my argument is that all the findings in social psychology that argue that humans are inherently bad, including bystander effect, for example, are flawed. So I really care about open science, and I care about replications, and I want to see whether the studies that are in our textbooks, whether they replicate or don't replicate. So in this lecture, I'll just show you some of the replications and the findings about human nature, not from the 1960s, 70s, following the Second World War, but try to update those to the today's knowledge. We'll start with one exercise. Imagine an airplane makes an emergency landing and breaks into 3 parts. This is from Rutger's book. As the cabin fills with smoke, everybody inside realizes we've got to get out of here. What happens? So this is a little bit extreme, just like you brought in the first comment. So on planet A, the passengers turn to their neighbors to ask if they're okay. Those needing assistance are helped out of the plane first. People are willing to give their lives, even for perfect strangers. Planet B, everyone's left to fend for themselves. Panic breaks out. There's lots of pushing and shoving. Children, the elderly, people with disabilities get trampled underfoot. Which planet do we live on? Planet A or planet B? We've watched some movies about this. We've heard all sorts of media. What commonly is portrayed? What kind of scene can you think of that is related to that? Where have we read about this? Sorry? In Titanic, yeah, very good. So So I think apocalyptic kind of messaging that comes from movies. Don't Look Up is really interesting because it's supposed to symbolize what the situations where we are right now. But I think typically most people actually answer B, the less optimistic, more pessimistic view of things. So this is from his book. I just used it over here, just copy pasted this. And he's actually interviewing a professor who did research on this and gave this to many, many people. I would estimate about 97% of people think that we live on planet B. The truth is, in almost every case that we live on planet A, doesn't matter who you ask, left wing or right, rich or poor, uneducated or well-read, all make the same error of judgment. They don't know, not freshmen or junior or grad students, not professional in most cases. We've had this information available to us since the Second World War. So we actually try to analyze real cases where catastrophes happen and whether people acted more like planet A, planet B. And it seems like most cases, the real cases are planet A, whereas we predict planet B. Usually I show that scene, and that scene is horrific because it really seems like chaos. So my memory of Titanic is, the romantic scenes and everything. Like you tend to forget that there was some devastation and like a horrific scene over there. But over 5 minutes, what you see is just utter chaos to the point that everybody is jumping on the boats, and then you need to use the rifles in order to fend them off and all of that. But the reality is that if you actually go and you read the testaments from that people who were actually there and were saved, is that they wrote there was no indication of panic or hysteria, no cries of fear. There was no running to and from. So overall, it just seems like the Titanic scene was a lot more cooperative, a lot more like planet A than planet B. Rutger also makes the point of us believing whether human nature is good or bad actually has an important impact on us. And I like this kind of story that he tells. I think it comes actually from this region. An old man says to his grandson, "There's a fight going on inside me. It's a terrible fight between two wolves. One is evil, angry, greedy, jealous, arrogant, cowardly. The other is good, peaceful, loving, modest, generous, honest, and trustworthy. These two wolves are fighting within you and inside every other person too." After a moment, the boy asks, "Which wolf will win?" The old man smiles, "The one that you feed." In psychology, we know this to be important. So the placebo effect is among the most consistent, strongest psychological effects to ever been demonstrated with real impact for medicine. So this is an example from Ted Jack, that is an expert on the placebo. I strongly recommend podcast Science Versus. So they try to disentangle different issues by looking at scientific evidence with citations and breaking this apart. And the placebo is one of them. And it's amazing that our ability to believe in something makes this a reality. If you believe that your immune system is strong, if you believe that something can help you, it has the potential of really helping you. There is an association between the mind and the immune system. It doesn't overcome everything. It doesn't solve, catastrophic problems in your health, but it definitely does help, which is why medicine now needs to compare, pharmaceuticals need to compare their efficacy against a placebo. I'm going to skip the video, but in this video over here, you can click on this and hear about Ted. Ted reflecting on this. In addition, we study in judgment decision-making a bunch of cognitive biases that reinforce our bias. So we talked briefly about negativity bias. So if we believe that something bad is going to happen, there is a potential of this actually happening at the end, confirmation bias, availability heuristic, and so forth. In 2019, came out a paper, social psychology paper in Science. It's very rare. It's very rare that social psychology study is published in something like Science, because Science is a very high top impact factor journal. But this is really considered to be groundbreaking, because actually what they've done was called the civic honesty around the globe. They wanted to know whether if they lose wallets in different places around the world, leave them in the street, whether people will return these wallets. So you leave some details in the wallets, there's money or some identifying details in there, some credit cards, or whether people will return these or not. So your prediction in general, what would happen with this kind of experiment? What kind of things, if we try and put the scientist hat on, what kind of predictions can we make about, let's say that we leave 10,000 wallets around the world, leave them in the street. What rate will come? What kind of different predictions can we make about moderators? What would you expect coming out from something like that? Yes, please. Amount of money inside, yeah, let's try and make a prediction. So what would you predict? More money, return more or less? Smaller amount take, larger amount give back. Something like that, yeah? Let's try and make this into a prediction. So let's say that we don't know and we try to make a prediction out of this. And you're hypothesizing a moderator. What kind of moderator? What's the relationship? Observed area, yeah? So it's a question of how many people are observing you. Inherently, you don't want to return the wallet, but because other people are looking, you will. Something like that? Okay, that's an interesting prediction. Even though you were looking at them. Time of day, because during the day, what happens during the day? Oh, the night is the time where you give in to temptation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. I see. Yeah, interesting. I like it. Good. All right. So this is what the study actually found. So it says, so they had 355 cities spanning 40 countries. In these experiments, we turned in more than 17,000 lost wallets containing varying amounts of money. So amount of money as a moderator was definitely looked at public and private institutions. So we have the public versus private. So already you came up with two important moderators. I don't know if they looked at time of the day, but that's also interesting. So good, you can also always think, like, before you actually read the article, just looking at the title, it's like, what would you do if you were the experimenter? Like, what do you want to know about this before you actually look at the findings? In virtually all countries, citizens were more likely to return wallets that contained more money. So that seems a little bit like what you expected. So this is in line with your predictions. Neither non-experts nor professional economists were able to predict this result. So you overcame in your prediction ability some of the experts in the field that hypothesized exactly the opposite from that. Additional data suggests that our main finding can be explained by a combination of altruistic concerns and an aversion to viewing oneself as a thief. Perhaps not applicable to the folks at the MTR, but here's something very interesting that immediately gets people worked up, especially here in this region. So here you have some comparison in different countries in the world. What do you see over here? This is the money versus no money. So whether the wallet has some amount to it, and the rates of reporting this and trying to bring this back. So you can see, like, Switzerland is very high, having more money, actually higher return rate. So you can see the red is almost always, aside from Mexico and Peru, to the right of no money. And then you have, like, decreasing reporting rates. Any observations about the figure on the right? China is at the bottom, yeah. What? Less developed countries, yeah. 2019, 18-19, yeah. So what's your take on this? What's your interpretation of this? High income, low income, yeah, that is interesting. Interesting prediction. Very good. I'll show you a little bit about that. Yes, income distribution. So differences between the wealthy, not wealthy. I want you to reflect on this and try to come up with explanations, because actually I think it's very harmful to try and find out explanations for this because we don't know. So we can come up with all sorts of hypotheses on why this happens, but I can tell you the Chinese, also some Hong Kongese, were not happy looking at this, and I'll show you some of the reactions. Just before we look at this, just to show that even between the money categories, so here they just have like no money and money. Here's example for 3 countries, Poland, United Kingdom, United States, about showing no money, money, and big money. So definitely the case that more money is returned more than just a lower amount of money. So they had like $0, 13.45, or 94.515. So it's interesting to see your prediction about amounts of money and how that might go. In addition, they also looked at predictions. So the prediction by an expert sample, this is what they predicted about the same. So this is the reality, right? And this is what the experts predicted before they saw the results, which is why it's very important that before we show the outcome to our audiences, we actually ask them, what do you think the outcome is going to be, to allow them to reflect on this. So this is what the expert said, but they were actually a little bit perhaps less biased than the non-expert sample, which predicted the exact opposite pattern from what was the actual reporting rate and returning the wallets. So that's what's really nice about this, and I think this is one of the reasons why it made so much noise and impact and got so much reaction and published in Science, is because not only have they found something interesting, but they also were able to show with evidence that this is counterintuitive by asking both experts and non-experts and showing that it's exactly the opposite trend from the non-experts and deviating from the trend in the expert sample. So I was very curious when this came out. This actually made the news in South China Morning Post and all of that. So what's going on with China? So Chinese score lowest in European, just look at how it's framed. Yeah. Chinese score lowest in European American research team's honesty study, but method may be flawed. Okay, so this the 4-year project ranks honesty in 40 countries. And now they've asked a bunch of professors in mainland China to explain this. So here's Wu Lin, a Wuhan University professor of sociology, called the study findings a bit unnerving, noting that it suggested that people in countries that are predominantly white population tended to be more honest than others. Of course, this is what you found because you're white and all the top ranking countries are white. You need to be very careful with these kinds of studies. So especially if there's the potential of finding that some countries are doing better than others, you at least want to make sure that your researcher team is a bit more diverse, so these kinds of complaints would be addressed. So when we do open science mass collaborations, we try to get a lot of people from many labs around the world in different countries, so there's no, it's not affiliated with one specific cultural context. There may be some problems in their methods. 2013, the researchers began dropping off. And then the next one. Okay. Wu said that the limitations in methodology would have hurt the accuracy of the research work. It studied a very specific group of people, receptionists working at a counter. Of course, this is not mentioned in the abstract. I think science papers are something like 3 pages long, which is very, very short. If you want to know anything about the methodology, you need to open the supplementary materials, which nobody ever reads, definitely not the media. So little details like that might matter are not actually reported very clearly, which is why generally open science, we try to be as transparent as possible, have as many details as possible. So this is talking about receptionists. Reception area staff in China, the world's most populous country, often work under high pressure and strain, he added. Other variables would have distorted the findings as well, Wu said. The receptionist might have put it aside because the wallet contained no or little money. There was no important personal items such as credit card, ID, driving license, and possibly they forgot about this. How about this explanation? No? Why not? Not convincing? Yes, convincing? A little bit convincing? Something? Now that we see one explanation, what other explanation? Like I've heard the 3 years that I've been showing this study, I've heard some really interesting reactions from students. What is like one major thing that can explain all of that in China? Any ideas? How many of you have been to mainland China or lived in China? Some of you? Yeah? How do you pay for things in China? Sorry? I've tried using cash in China many times. It's actually a big problem for a tourist to use. Even homeless people have like the barcode asking you. It's like you give them money, they don't know what to do with it. It's very strange. I've never seen anything like this anywhere else in the world. China has really adopted digital currency to the extreme. So you need your WeChat or Alipay or whatever it is that you use. I think nowadays you can use Alipay Hong Kong to pay Alipay China, but back 5 years ago, 4 years, how long is pandemic? 4 years ago, last time I was in China, I couldn't use my Alipay Hong Kong, and then you can't use cash in like many of the taxis. I don't know, it's just like a big mess if you're a tourist. So they don't know what to do with cash, even if they, so I think just like the way that they reflect on cash, what cash means to them, is one of the most convincing student explanations that I've heard about this. In addition, and I like this explanation as well, another detail that we might not know, most Chinese citizens do not use email for daily communication, which is how they were expecting to get their report on the wallet. Adding that the report rate for China might have been higher if the card had a phone number with a We account on it. Huh. So maybe you need to adjust things culturally before you run a study somewhere. We also pointed out that wallets are rarely used in Chinese city because most pay things by mobile phones. Very convincing to me. And then, of course, you ask the other side, what did you do? Did you take these things into account? So they defended the study's method, saying that all the elements have been considered, but none seem to explain why China's score was so low. Goes to show you that even academic findings end up having this little, conflict over nothing. I think the more important thing is for us to reflect about what would we do better if we ran the study. So we should do replications for this kind of thing. If you ever want to lose some wallets with me in mainland China, I'm very happy to do things with you. I can't do this because I have white skin and I'm not mainland Chinese, but if you feel like you want to run this kind of thing, I can run this in Israel, you can run this in China, we can run this in other places. That seems like a really fun study to replicate, right? And then we can take into account, we can learn from their mistakes perhaps, so we can put a WeChat account or some other means of contacting the person, maybe some other things that indicate money. I don't know. So we definitely need a replication and extension for that. Before we head off to the bystander effect, I'll give you a 5 minutes break just after I show you the video I saw recently as a YouTube short.
I like living here. You'll see things in New York you don't see other places. Yeah. I was walking on Fifth Avenue. I came across a man that was laying there on Fifth Avenue bleeding. Other people walking by him. I couldn't believe it. I was the only one that had my phone out recording him.
So that's a twist to the bystander effect. Good. 5 minutes break, we'll come back, we'll talk about the findings. Okay, great. So let's continue. Bystander effect. Thanks for bringing this up. This is a summary by a BBC program that I like to kind of get us into the feel of what is the bystander effect.
Watch a pickpocket in action. The woman with the rucksack is his victim, and the man in the grey top on the left is the thief. Except they're both acting. In fact, everyone in the queue is with us, apart from the man in the blue shirt. As the thief moves in, will our bystander notice? He clearly has. What's more, he's seen that other people in the queue have noticed too. Now, what's he going to do about it? The answer is nothing. After all, no one else in the queue reacts, so why should he? Chances are, you wouldn't have done anything either. Whatever the man in the blue shirt thinks he's seen, he's influenced by the apathy of everyone else in the queue. In more serious situations, this could have disturbing consequences. Liverpool Street Station in London. A drunk lies on the pavement. In fact, he's our actor Peter, but these passers-by aren't to know that. And since he looks the worse for wear, not critically ill, they ignore him. Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow. This time, we've dressed Peter as a respectable city gent. How long before he's rescued now that he looks the part?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right, thanks.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir. And suddenly, everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
While you're lying on the floor in the rain?
After a couple of minutes, even the police turn up.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
Our actress Ruth takes Peter's place. She's not a drunk, but she's also not a city gent. How long before she gets help? Four minutes have passed, and 34 people have passed.
People don't really want to know that they just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
But it's more complicated than that. If the street were deserted, a passerby would probably go to the rescue. But these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't help. This woman, for instance, has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing.
You all right? You all right?
Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right, you sure?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
She don't look well, does she?
You all right, yeah? You sure?
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
Peter's now having the same problem. This time, we've swapped his suit for casual clothes. He's not drunk, and we've asked him to act like he's in pain.
Help! Help! Help me! Please, somebody! Help me! Help me, somebody! Please help me! Help me! Help me! Help me! Please, somebody help me! Please, somebody help me!
Yeah, a little bit difficult to watch this kind of thing. You know, I've watched this many times. What's your take from this? Some interesting things to reflect on, right? So I think with the wallets, you were saying something about if there's more people observing, people are more likely to return the wallet. But it seems like something opposite is happening over here, right? What is the bystander effect that they're referring to? What happens? Yeah, it seems like what they're saying is that if you have more people are ignoring, there forms a group with a certain norm, and this is why people are not helping. What else did you notice? What kind of interesting things? Change of clothes, yeah. If you do need help, just make sure that you wear a suit. Yeah, good. What else? Yeah, so if somebody like the fireman makes an intervention, deviates from the norm, then suddenly other people come in. Or once one person notices other people come in. Yeah, very good observation. So this is the story that I've done my undergraduate in psychology and computer science, but mostly major psychology. And this was the prominent thing that in the textbooks and everything. And all this dates back to the 1960s. To this article, which contrasts the number of people that are around. So the green one is the highest rates of actually helping. But the more people that are around, like one person or 4 people, then the rates are decreasing, and then it takes longer to intervene. So this is the duration, and this is the helping rates. And this has been studied for a long time during the 60s, generally saying that one-on-one people, just a chance of helping. If there's one-on-one and there's no other people, then people will tend to help. So inherently good, but there is something about other people around us that decreases helping. So diffuse responsibility. And interestingly, many times we try and look, instead of an individual study, we try to do a meta-analysis. So 13 years after the first study came out, they did a meta-analysis summarizing. Their summary is 10 years of research of the bystander effect means that this is robust across all emergency types and all populations. Overall helping may increase or decrease because of variety issue. The pattern of less helping with bystander seem to be consistent. So there's all sorts of reasons for why this might happen. Now, interestingly, if we try to do the history of psychology and why we study certain things, this is the case that started the whole story with the bystander effect. So we're talking about the 1964 Kitty Genovese. I think somebody over here raised this before. And not too long ago, so this is 2-3 years ago, came out a video of the person who killed Kitty Genovese, who went to prison for his entire life, actually died at prison at age 81, which got me looking into this, which puzzled me completely, because what I found out when I dug into the story of the bystander effect and Kitty Genovese just blew my mind. So we'll start unraveling this whole story and how this affects the research with Kitty Genovese and the bystander effect. See?
Her name was Kitty Genovese, a woman whose murder became infamous the world over because nobody tried to save her. Listen to how it was reported.
At least 38 residents of this apartment building heard her screams and did nothing.
That's the legacy of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens, New York in 1964. Her story is taught in psychology classes, and her name is synonymous with people who look the other way when trouble happens.
Nothing, no witnesses, just a lot of listeners. It's the post-Kitty Genovese era. No one wants to look, they think they'll get involved.
In 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her home in the middle of the night.
Incredibly, last Sunday's episode of HBO's Girls featured a staged reenactment of the Kitty Genovese case.
Dad, I think there's a lady in the courtyard.
It can't be anything good this time of night.
Hearing of Winston Moseley's death, Girls creator Lena Dunham wrote on Instagram, "Today we learn her killer has died. Spooky timing. Rest in peace, Kitty." So what really happened the night Kitty Genovese was murdered? Kevin Cook is the author of Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America.
The idea that New Yorkers watched and did nothing, didn't lift a finger to help this poor dying girl, stuck in the public mind, but it was a lot more complicated than that.
It happened here. Kitty Genovese was almost home when she heard a man's footsteps behind her. She ran, but the man caught up to her and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed, "Oh God, I've been stabbed." What happened next? That's where fact and fiction take separate paths.
He fled. She turned and went back around this corner.
Kitty was attacked by a man named Winston Moseley. The author says the fact that she was able to walk after the initial attack probably led people to believe they didn't have to call the cops.
People are looking out their windows. They see Kitty Genovese here. They see her struggle to her feet. She staggers around this corner into the darkness And is no longer visible to
So
the
she's
people.
no longer visible to the people over here. It was past 3 a.m. Thinking the trouble was over, people went back to bed. They were unaware that a wounded Kitty Genovese was still in mortal danger.
Kitty sought shelter in here. She was able to get into this door.
That's when Mosley returned and raped and stabbed Kitty to death in this vestibule. According to Cook, a man at the top of the stairs saw it happen, but did nothing to stop it. A tragic story, but it got much worse 2 weeks later when a front-page story in the New York Times declared 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The author says that number was totally distorted.
There were certainly dozens of ear witnesses and eyewitnesses, but when you talk about the people who both heard something or saw something and knew what it meant, knew what was going on, I don't think it's more than half a dozen.
And Cook says one neighborhood man remembers his dad calling the cops on that fateful night.
He swears that his father did call the police, was put on hold, told the police, there's a woman staggering around out there, she's been beaten up, you need to come. There was no answer to that call. In those days, there was no 911 system. That's something that grew out of the Kitty Genovese case.
So the legend of Kitty Genovese was born.
Led to many sermons in churches. It led to gossip. It went viral in the way.
So already the famous story that we heard of, that a lot of people saw Kitty Genovese and failed to help, already seems a little bit different than what perhaps has happened in reality. So I watched this video when the person died, and I wanted to know, what does this mean? Do we have some evidence about what actually happened during that night? Turns out there's actually a lot of articles that have been written on this. So here is one from Psychology Today, September 2007. So many years, American psychologist, which is a very, it's a big publication in psychology. And this is what they write. The story of 38 witnesses who remained inactive during the murder is not supported by the available evidence. There is no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. We already know that at least one person probably called the police and tried to do something about this. But turns out that there was a lot more going on. So the front page report in New York Times incorrectly identified 38 indifferent witnesses to the crime, fueling fears of apathy and urban decay. Here is New York Times going back. So the New York Times is the one that published the original story, and then they went back to their archives on what it is that they found many years ago, and this is what they wrote so many years later. The article grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack. Only a few had glimpsed part of it or recognized the cries for help. Many thought that they have heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3. Afterwards, 2 people did call the police. And finally, and this is the most shocking of this, a 70-year-old woman ventured out 3 in the morning and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. Finally, somebody did arrive over there. And Miss Genovese died on the way to the hospital. So the story about nobody cared, nobody did anything, everybody just let the whole thing happen is very different. And New York Times takes responsibility by saying, actually, we reported this wrong. We had the evidence, but we wanted to make a statement about this. We wanted to create a story about this, but now they've corrected the record. So both the 3 books and the article and New York Times finally in 2016 claiming responsibility for reporting this incorrectly. Just shocking. So here you can see another reporting on this, like in 2020. One neighbor actually raced from her apartment to rescue Miss Genovese, knowing she was in distress but unaware whether her assailant was still on the scene. It's clear she went to great efforts to save and comfort Kitty. So this is not what I learned in my undergraduates. This is not what's in our textbooks. We hear about Kitty Genovese, the bystander, like we just take it for granted that this is how things are. Finally, if we do want to do a meta-analysis on a bystander effect in 2011, looking at all the evidence, everything that was done, and this is even before, you know, the replication crisis, the science reform movement. So I don't know exactly what is included in all this, but already looking at all the evidence together. So they looked at 7,700 participants, overall effect size of Cohen's Hedges G, Cohen's D of 0.35. What they were saying is that the bystander effect was weaker when the situations were perceived as dangerous. So actually people were more likely to help if situation was dangerous. If there was no reason to, you know, it's not that dangerous, there's no reason for me to intervene, it will solve itself. But if it becomes dangerous, then people intervene. Perpetrators were present, so if the criminals are still there with the crime, people are more likely to help. And then the cost of intervention were physical. So actually people were willing to put themselves at risk, physical risk, in order to help somebody else. This is not what I studied when I was an undergraduate. This is not what's in our textbooks. So what is it about the bystander? What should we take away from this? This year, another amazing study, just like the lost wallets and a few other mega studies that came out this amazing study as summarized by the BBC.
That idea of us being individuals that are only interested in our own interests, that is not how it works. The myth is that when people observe somebody in need of help in public, then they have a tendency to kind of just stand there and look at each other. Our research shows that that's not at all what's happening. From pretty low-scale conflicts to stabbings and really severe violence. In all types of situations, they try to de-escalate the conflict. They put themselves between the conflict parties, trying to pull them apart. So is it always a good idea to play an active role, you know? Is it also a good idea to be active if you are in an armed robbery situation? We were surprised by the high frequency of it, and we were also surprised by seeing similar frequencies in these 3 different countries that we looked at. As a cultural anthropologist, I would have expected pretty big cultural differences, but what we see is that there are some universal features in these very tense situations. A lot of social psychologists would be pretty upset if I would say that I disproved it. In many ways, I think we did, but the point is that they've been looking at something else than what we've been looking at. So our point now is a bit, you know, now with the CCTV footage, we can actually gain understanding of human behavior in a way that we haven't been able to get before. Violence and aggression, you can't study that in a lab setting. The urgency is different in real life. So that idea, if you stumble when you enter the subway and people will not help you, I mean, that's not what we see. That's an idea that we all have, but that's not how the reality works.
Yeah, so that's a good summary to this whole thing. We thought we knew one thing about human nature, about how people act in this situation. Sorry, just gonna close this. But turns out that this is not exactly the case. First of all, if we go and look at the details of what was actually taking place at that time, we realize completely different understanding of the context of the story. Then the findings, if we actually do a meta-analysis and we look at everything that has been published on the topic, sometimes we see completely opposite effects. And then when we run a study like this, looking at actual footage from CCTV cameras, then we find something completely that blows our mind. So this is summarized over here, also American psychologist. This is what they found, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and South Africa. And we show that in 9 of 10 public conflicts, at least one bystander, but typically several, will do something to help, which is quite remarkable. Since then, I've seen all sorts of other studies come out. Another summary over here. In the presence of danger, bystanders were 19 times more likely to intervene than in the absence of danger. So danger makes it more likely for other people to put themselves at risk, which is not what is recommended by the police. So this is into 2021. Very interesting. And if we look at the trends, this just came out, when did I find this? Yeah, this year, 2022, looking at the rates of cooperation. So you mentioned the prisoner's dilemma, so all kinds of cooperation, social dilemma paradigms, looking at how much people cooperate over time. So at least in the United States, there's a trend of people becoming more and more cooperative over time rather than more selfish over time. So really interesting, controlling for all sorts of factors between states and so forth. We found no evidence for declining cooperation within 61-year period. Instead, we found a slight increase in cooperation over time. So I really like this. And I have a bunch of other like evidence in support of that. How easy it is to corrupt us. Zimbardo, Stanford experiment. Somebody can summarize very briefly what the findings are in the Stanford experiment, rather than us having to listen to Zimbardo. So the story, the way that I heard it also in undergraduate, is very much like this. So students, part of a regular experiment in Stanford, came in randomly assigned to being either the prisoners or being the jailers, taking, having to observe the prisoners. And then very fast things deteriorated and escalated. What happened with the Stanford Prison experiment? I have to say that to me, this is absolutely shocking. I did not really, when I was an undergraduate, this was people considered this to be the top of what social psychologists do. Unfortunately, everything is wrong about this. It's not an experiment. Zimbardo, who I think should answer for these kinds of things, faked a lot of stuff, manipulated all sorts of things. And this is like Simin Vazir. She's now the editor of Collabora Psychology. She's one of the open science reform movement. This is her tweet. Psychologists, please read this. We must stop celebrating this work. It's anti-scientific. Get it out of the textbooks. It's very difficult to get it out of the textbooks. Even if we really try to change it, it's in our libraries. We have old versions. And this is the New York Post. Famed Stanford Prison experiment was a fraud, scientists say. So looking at this is really unbelievable. So some researchers and reporters decided to go into this and look up the archive of the notes that actually Zimbardo did and interview each person who is still alive and can be spoken about what actually took place over there. Document all of this, and the stuff that they unfolded is remarkable. So there's a lot going on over here. I won't go into all the details, but there's lots of problems with almost every part of that narrative. A lot of the students actually felt like they were acting. It's not really clear what the abuse was.
I was incapable of this kind of behavior.
I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know?
Yeah, so there were clear instructions by Zimbardo, who, which is something that you're not supposed to do, acted as the prison chief, where he told the jailers what to do. All sorts of places in where we would intervene and stop. If this was really an experiment, we would stop the experiment. This was not an experiment. They were not randomly assigned. A lot of acting going on, a lot of instructions telling the participants what to do. Really some shocking stuff. Lots of confessions from people who took part in this study saying that things were faked and not as described. So Zimbardo is unable, I've listened to a bunch of interviews with him. He's unable to defend all of these, and sometimes it just feels like, or they show that he's actually outright lying about things. So a very, very unfortunate thing. This is like the summary, a lot of headlines. So the Stanford Prison experiment was massively influential. We just learned it was a fraud, deeply flawed, and it was wrong. Okay, so you might say, so what? So he intervened a little bit. Nothing. We still have much to gain from this because we have seen something in there that was not supposed to happen. So the question is, let's say that we run this again, what would happen? If we run a replication of the famous Stanford experiment, what would happen? It's difficult to run this kind of thing. It's difficult to get ethical approval for this, but we've already seen in previous trolley dilemmas that TV shows do whatever they want. And turns out that the BBC actually ran the Stanford experiment again. And you can go and watch this. It's quite disturbing how the TV shows don't care too much about the ethical complications. But then again, when you see, I don't know, Survivor and The Amazing Race and all that, to me, this is putting people to the extreme. The stuff that people are willing to do, it's unbelievable. So why not go to prison? Why not? You know, you get some exposure on TV. But what's interesting about this is that this was actually published as a paper where they analyzed all sorts of things. So rethinking the psychology of tyranny, the BBC prison study. And unlike the prisoners, the guards failed to identify with their role. This made the guards reluctant to impose their authority, and they were eventually overcome by the prisoners. So everything about the dynamic between these two groups is nothing like what happened in the Stanford experiment. And then what the end result was, participants then established an egalitarian social system. They opened a commune, they held hands together, sang songs together. This is the end of the BBC prison experiment. This is how people are inherently bad, and if you just put them in the right situation, they will get, you know, to abuse other people and so forth. Go watch this. It's really interesting to see what happens, and everything was documented very well, unlike the Stanford experiment. So it gets you thinking about this. If you want a complete debunk of everything in the Stanford prison experiment, again, the American psychologist takes this down completely. So looking at all the data collected, all the archives, all the interviews with all 15 participants, lots of criticism. Really, somebody should hold Zimbardo accountable for this. I don't know what to say about that. Last thing that we're going to touch is the Milgram experiments. Already we know bystander effect, not what we thought. Stanford experiment, not what we thought. How about the Milgram experiments? First, what is the Milgram experiment? Yeah, that's a good description. So what we have is that people were made to believe that they're supposed to be, that they were randomly assigned to be the educators, and the way that you would educate somebody who is in a different room is that you would give them a test, and if they fail on this test, you're supposed to give them electric shocks. And the more mistakes that they make, the higher the electric shocks, all the way to something that is fatal. And the research question was, would they take part in this? How far would they go? What would happen when the other participant, so-called participant, the alleged participant, starts to yell or scream? Right? So the results were, what was the result, if you recall? Yeah, so the researcher's role was always to say, they made them look really like a doctor, so a white coat, the experiment requires that you proceed. So every time the person objected and said, but I think I'm hurting him, can you or her, can you go check on the other person? The only response that they would say, the experiment requires that you proceed. So seeing how authority would get the person to be obedient and proceed with electric shocks. Till when will people say yes and go along with this? And there's a surprising high rate of people who went all the way to the highest electric shock, which is supposed to be fatal, regardless of the screams coming from the other room. What's your thoughts about this? Replicates, doesn't replicate, holds true? Are we going to find some dubious things about this one as well? Does this seem convincing to you? How many people think will hold? One. How many people think is dubious? Something is going to change here? Most of you? Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Unfortunately, the Milgram experiment replicates very well, many times. And this is the one thing I think that we can take away about the dark side. And we've tried to replicate this, not me specifically, but people in social psychology. Many times, this is a study, 2006, obedience rates in the 2006 replication were only slightly lower than Milgram 45 years later. Another one, meta-Milgram, looking at different studies, 23 small samples, obedience involved progression to maximum voltage, overall rate 43%, which is very much like Milgram. Also, once again, TV show, I don't know, do you know Darren Brown? Really extreme stuff. His latest one that I watched was him trying to use psychological tricks to get somebody to act altruistic, to put his life in danger in order to save somebody who he is biased against. In this case, he is a little bit racist towards a member of minority and Hispanic minorities. So he was using all kinds of influence techniques in order to get the person to actually put himself at risk in order to save an immigrant from getting hurt. So I don't know how much of that is solid. This is a TV show, but he did also a version of the Milgram experiment, and it's pretty amazing to see. We wouldn't do the whole thing. I'm just going to show you a little part of this.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450 volts.
450.
Which is remarkable because these people signed up to take part in a TV show. So they're observed. They're not necessarily aware that they're observed at this stage because the way that they set this whole thing up, they don't know what it is that they signed up for completely. The whole episode is mind-blowing, I have to say. You can go and watch the whole thing. But the rates are very close to what Milgram found. So again and again, we're able to find support for this. So I would have liked, when I saw, okay, Bystander unfolds, the Stanford experiment unfolds, I really thought maybe Milgram as well. I had the same kind of intuition and I went through the same kind of journey as you. But there is something here in this experiment that is very solid. Here's a recent one, 2015, showing very similar results as well. I think this is from a Polish sample. Yeah. What's the conclusion from this? What's to take away from this whole thing? I'll let you reflect on this. Are we inherently bad? Are we inherently good? We're going to talk a little bit more about that, maybe also about babies and where we come from and what happens when we're little in the next session. But my conclusion that builds on Rutger's and the book that came out, very similar conclusions, the both of us, I strongly recommend that you read Humankind, because he not only breaks apart the studies that we talked about, but he talks about Lord of the Flies, I think, the book where he found a real case of kids that were really stranded on an island. And it's amazing to see what happened there. Not only did they not, you know, go against each other, but they helped each other survive, and they were actually doing quite well when they found them at the end. So he has a lot of these case studies. He did a remarkable reporting job. There is no evidence that human nature is inherently bad. It's very concerning that right now the social psychology books, everything that we learn about human nature is that we're inherently bad, but this does not seem to be the case. Evidence, if there is evidence, suggests otherwise. Classic findings in social psychology are unfortunately biased and flawed. Whenever you hear something or read something in a textbook, please go and check the recent evidence, meta-analysis, open science, go and check what it is that happened over there. When we look at replications, they show that if anything, there is tendency for people to help and be pro-social, both in the bystander, losing wallets, CCTV. Human nature, however, can be affected, and we can see this in different classic articles, such as the Milgram experiment, that there is definitely an in-group, out-group bias. Morality is complex. We've seen this also with the trolleys. And unfortunately, authority and power has the ability to corrupt us, even something as simple as seeing an experimenter in a white coat telling you that you must proceed with the experiment. So there's some things for us to learn about human nature and how this applies to us, but at least I would like you to take away to question what it is that's been given to you, look at the evidence, and try to have a more complex understanding of social psychology phenomena. Go home, think about this. If you have some questions, you can post this on Slack, or we'll talk a bit about this next week. I like that. Thank you.